Okay, folks, thank you so much for coming and joining me here today for our School of the Environment seminar series itself. And nice to see you too here, Michael, for joining us. You told me you weren't coming. That's all right. All right, so thank you so much to everyone. The host of the day is Greg Webb, and unfortunately, Greg couldn't get here. He had a few other issues he had to take care of, but he was going to introduce me. So if you'll allow myself to introduce myself. My name is Gilbert Price. I'm an academic within our School of the Environment here and a vertebrate paleontologist. And one of my big research interests is in really trying to understand the extinction of what we call the Quaternary Ice Age animals. Now, if Greg was here, he'd tell you firstly a bit about me and probably my academic ancestry. And I'm very proud to say that I'm an academic descendant of Professor Dorothy Hill. And Dorothy was an incredible paleontologist, an incredible scientist, really. She was the very first female professor at any Australian university, which is a great honour. She was a champion hockey player. She was a code breaker in World War II, working underneath Douglas MacArthur. She was the first female president of the Australian Academy of Sciences. She was the first female president of UQ's own academic board as well. And so she's left a pretty amazing legacy. And I think about Dorothy in the context of her being like my academic kind of great grandma. So she was my supervisor. So I joined the university without even knowing really anything about Dorothy many, many years ago. And I was working under the sort of supervision by a guy called Jianxing Zhao. And Jianxing is still here, and he is a leading geochemist working over in the radiogenic isotope facility in the Richards building. And when I came here straight out of my PhD, I was very lucky to have that kind of wonderful experience where I got to work with someone who is such a kind man and a real specialist in the field. So I picked up a lot of skills in things like geochemistry and in particular things like uranium series dating. And it was such a different experience and a different kind of background that a lot of other researchers in this space have had before. So a lot of people come into things like vertebrate paleontology through the kind of through the door, of things like biology. And so everyone usually has a really clear biological and ecological background if you're working in this field. And that was certainly the case for me, but I was lucky to have that aspect of geochemistry as well. Anyway, I do a bit of teaching here at the university, and thank you to you guys. There's a few people online who are in my undergraduate classes, some of my tutors, some of us our research students that are in the room at the moment as well. So it's really lovely to have everyone here. Now, what I want to talk about today is a documentary that came out. I might just move that mouse out of the way. A documentary series that came out by ABC's Catalyst Science television program earlier this year, talking specifically about some of the extinct Ice Age animals of Australia. And when I talk about the Ice Ages, we're really just kind of using that as a colloquial term for the Quaternary. So the Quaternary started around about 2.5 million years ago. It was characterized by really intense climatic shifts where we see glacials and interglacial cycles through time, so big temperature shifts. And we, believe it or not, we're actually still in the Quaternary today. So 2.5 million years ago to this very second that we're in. Now, earlier this year, Catalyst put out this 2-part documentary talking specifically about extinctions and specifically about these animals that we often refer to as the megafauna themselves. And these are the Ice Age giants that I'm going to be talking about today. And I really love this series so much. So I was a scientific consultant on it, but I can't take credit for what ABC did. They were absolutely brilliant. Now, one of the things I really loved about this documentary series, firstly, is that it put these animals at the forefront of members of the Australian public itself. So from my experience teaching and talking to members of the public, if you ask anyone just about to name me, 2 or 3 species of extinct animals known on the basis of fossils, they would probably say something like T-Rex or Stegosaurus or Triceratops. Now, all these organisms themselves, they're all dinosaurs, so they're not what we're talking about here at all today, and none of those things are Australian. Now, if you said, okay, well, name me an animal from the Ice Age, and they might tell you something about like a saber-toothed cat or a woolly mammoth, or maybe it's a woolly rhinoceros, something like that. But again, none of these organisms are from Australia itself. And so the beautiful thing I think about this particular program is it put these animals kind of front and center. Now, the story of Australia's megafauna is not just a story for academics and people doing research, it's a story of all of us. It's a story that taps into things like traditional owner histories and environmental management. It's a story of climate change. It's the stories of evolution and extinction and success in the environment itself. But it's all of our story. And that's what I really loved about this program itself. So I just wanted to play a very short part of one of the promo videos that ABC put together. So you might have to just click the play button.
Ice Age Australia.
Okay.
Home to giant
So the audio, unfortunately, isn't coming through at the moment. It doesn't really matter, though, at the moment. But what you can see here is just a depiction of some of the incredible animals that used to call Australia home at some point in earlier parts of the Quaternary itself. So there were giant quadrupedal marsupials that were up to around about my size or so at the shoulder itself, so weighing up to about 3,000 kilograms. There's incredible kangaroos. Some of these kangaroos got up to about 2.5+ meters in height. The biggest venomous lizards that ever existed. So you saw an example there of a thing called Megalania. That animal on the screen at the moment is a marsupial lion. It's basically kind of like a wombat that has turned bad over about 20 million years worth of evolution. So it was the largest marsupial predator of all time. And there's around about 90 different species of these organisms that we don't have anywhere on the planet at all anymore. And the reason for that is because they've become extinct. And that's really one of the big research questions that we have that's been enduring in Australia since the recovery of the very first fossils of these things all the way back in the 1830s. But the question is, what happened to them? Why don't we have them anymore? And it's one of the longest, probably the longest running scientific debate anywhere on the planet these days itself. And so the series was put together by the ABC, and you can see several people on the screen at the moment who are some of the leading researchers in the field, plus me as well. But they've done a really amazing job in putting this thing together. So the series itself was narrated by a guy that you guys may have heard called Hugh Jackman. And Hugh Jackman, if you're Australian at least, you'll probably know him best for his work as a guest actor in the 1990s cop series Blue Heelers. He was the guest judge on Red Faces on Hey Hey It's Saturday in episode 39 in 1997. And he was also once interviewed by Bert Newton on Good Morning Australia, which is pretty cool. The thing about Hugh as well, he went on to do a little bit of acting in Hollywood, went into some movies and stuff like that. I don't know too much about it, but Hugh was the narrator of this particular program, and he came onto, as I understand it, the program pretty late in the piece. And I thought that was a really wonderful part of the production from the ABC team, because over the course of several years, they've been working to put the story together and eventually got Hugh in. And of course, you know, if you're overseas, you're probably able to syndicate and sell the story of Australia's megafauna to international channels and stuff like that. But this is a series anyway, so it's called Megafauna, What Killed Australia's Giants. If you haven't seen it yet and you want to go and check it out, I'll put together a QR code that goes straight to ABC iView. So ABC iView hosts this. So if you're in Australia at the moment, you should be able to watch this for free. I don't know if we've got people from elsewhere, you might not be able to access it. But that's what the QR code is there anyway, if you want to check it out. Now, the story behind this is that a couple of years ago, I think it was 2021 or so, I got a phone call from a guy called Ollie. And Ollie was a researcher for Catalyst in the science department. And he called me up and he said he was really interested in pursuing the idea of putting together a documentary about the megafauna of Australia. And he had been talking to these other researchers in the field. And the funny thing across the last 15 or 20 years in this particular sort of field is that a lot of the leading voices that have kind of come about and published some of the biggest papers aren't actually paleoscientists at all. They're not archaeologists, they're not people that do the dating. They're basically modern ecologists that do a lot of statistical analysis and modeling. So a group of scientists have come into the field and they basically data mine. And so they collect data about basically the timing of the fossils and figuring out when things might have lived in this particular area or that area over there, and take all that data and basically produce statistical models on the basis of that and model the timing of the extinctions of these things. So they're very, very clear in a lot of their writings about exactly what happened to the megafauna. So when Ollie was talking to me, he started asking me a lot of these questions about, you know, the research that bloke over there found or that lady over there found, particularly on the basis of the modeling. And I said, Ollie, that doesn't make any kind of sense. Like, there's a lot of areas that have kind of crept into the field when it comes to doing this modeling. And it's areas coming down a lot of times to things like misunderstanding about biology and ecology of these extinct organisms. And one of the things I'll show you later is that we really don't know that much about them. There's other areas in terms of interpreting aspects of dating, so geochronology. And then there was also other aspects of, many, many different things and areas they were crept in. So Ollie had and I had this very long conversation, about 2 hours, and we were talking about all of these things. And he's like, oh, he's very confused, but he ended up hanging up the phone, and that was about it. Then around about 18 months or so later, Ollie called me back, and he said, Gilbert, when I spoke to you on the phone, you were telling me all this stuff that just didn't make sense. It didn't seem consistent with what other people had been telling him. He said, but one thing I've done is that I've gone through, I've started talking to other people working in the field, people maybe a little bit like me. So people on the ground working at, for example, Flinders University, and I think we've got a few people on Flinders online at the moment. People working across areas of on-ground field-based paleontology, people working in the archaeological space, people working in things like biomechanics, so understanding the biology of organisms and stuff like that. And he said his eyes completely opened up to, firstly, the amazing story of the megafauna, but really about how little we know about these organisms themselves. And that's sort of where the whole premise of the series came from. And so what I really love about what Ollie and all the other researchers and the director, Jeff, whose name is up on the screen there, did, is they were able to tell the story of these amazing organisms and use the most cutting edge and latest state of knowledge of all of these different things. So going back over the course of a couple of years, Ollie would contact me fairly regularly, and many of the other people who are involved in the series itself in terms of scientists, asking various kind of questions. We'd see models of the organisms that you saw walking across the screen a second ago, asking, should the legs look like this? What about the teeth? That kind of thing. So a lot of the reconstructions that you see are literally what we know about these organisms at the moment. So I thought that's really beautiful. But we have that ongoing debate. And this was something that was touched on by the Catalyst program itself, like what happened to them, what caused their extinction. And if you break it down, it really comes down to two dominant hypotheses. The first one is the idea that humans arrived in Australia sometime around about 60-ish thousand years ago, maybe a bit earlier, maybe a bit later, depending who you talk to. And humans may have come up against an ecosystem, a fauna of these big animals that may have been naive to a new super intelligent predator like humans themselves. So maybe it was a case that humans came in and overhunted these animals to extinction, either rapidly or drawn over long periods of time. Humans also have that amazing ability to have other tools on the belt as well, things like the ability to light fires. So using fires to change ecosystems that may have been detrimental to the persistence of many of those big animals I was talking about. So there's around about 90 species of big animals I'm talking about. So just keep that in mind. So that's the human side, or the anthropogenic side. And the other big argument is the climate change hypothesis. And that basically comes down to the idea that there may have been long-term changes in the glacial and interglacial cycles I was talking about through time towards drier and drier and drier environments, eventually culminating in a glacial cycle that may have been more intense than anything else that had come previously. And that may have been one of the key factors that wiped out many of the members of the megafauna. There may be combinations of both of these things going on as well, of course, but they're the two real dominant types of ones. Now, one of the big challenges in testing these is really a lack of data available to test them. So you might think, okay, well, one of the first things that you need to do is have dates for the fossils. You need information about the archaeological record. If you're going to test something like a climate change extinction idea, you need to have independent palaeoclimate data for the actual megafauna sites where the fossils and all these things are occurring. And we have a bit of information like that, but we don't have a lot. So I just want to have a quick look at some of the data that is available. And I put a little bit of a clickbait actually into my abstract for the talk, and I said I was going to show you guys some new exciting kind of discovery. I'm not actually going to do that, but I'm going to show you 3 bits of exciting new discoveries that I'm fortunate enough to be a part of, and some people in the room actually part of this as well and online. Firstly, things like diprotodons. Like diprotodons were the iconic member of the Australian Ice Age megafauna. These guys were the ones that were at least up to my height at the shoulder. And in the room at the moment, I don't know how many people we got because I can't count very well, but I reckon like if we took maybe everybody at least on this side and maybe from you, Kim, across and combined you into one single organism, you'd probably be the equivalent weight to just one single diprotodon. So that's sort of how big that we're talking, around about 3,000 kilograms or so. Now, diprotodon itself was the most widespread member of any of the extinct megafauna of Australia. It's obviously a big marsupial. We often refer to it as being wombat-like, and things that we've discovered about diprotodon in the past few years is that it wasn't wombat-like at all. It was big, it walked around very differently, it was built very differently, and it also had the ability to migrate over great distances themselves, so it's nothing like a wombat at all. but purely thinking about the dates that we have for this organism. Now, if I've got, I'm quite critical of some of the big data modeling papers that I was talking about before, but one of the things that I think that is really highlighted in those works is the fact that we don't have enough dates to be able to test even the timing of the extinctions of some of these things. Now, according to the modelers, they consider Diprotodon to be one of the best dated members of any of the 90 species of megafauna. And so this is a species, Diprotodon optatum, that is found anywhere from Cairns down to Tassie, inland Australia, going all the way across to WA. And it's represented by about 20 or so reliably dated layers of rock or strata. You might think, oh, well, 20, well, that's not really that much, is it? Because if you think about it, like Diprotodon has been around for about 2 million years. So on average, we've got one dated record of a Diprotodon every 100,000 years or so. That's not the kind of chronology that you want. Now, organisms like this, believe it or not, I'm not making this up, this is the ninja turtle. So ninja turtles were real. The scientific name for this thing is Ninjames oweni, and we know bugger all about it. We've got some fossils from the skull, we've got some fossils from the tail, and no, nothing else. It has never, ever been dated. We know that it exists in deposits that might have some Pleistocene or Quaternary aged organisms in there, but this thing has never been dated, so we know nothing about the timing of its extinction at all. So we can't test it against models that need timing, such as when humans turned up or when climate goes bad or anything like that. Now, of the 90 species of megafauna, most of them have chronologies a lot closer to Ninjames, the ninja turtle, than they do Diprotodon. So very few species actually even have dates. Where we do have dates for some organisms, they don't even occur within the time frame of some of the hypothesized extinction times, being 40 to 50,000 years. So it makes it really difficult to test some of these extinction ideas when you have chronologies or geochronologies that are that kind of patchy, I would say. Many of the organisms that we're dealing with too, I just kind of alluded it to with the ninja turtle there, but we know almost nothing about them. This organism here is part of a skull and part of a mandible, or something that my team and I described a couple of years ago. Now, the species itself is a wombat. It's a giant wombat. It probably stood around about the hip or so in terms of height. There's a thing called Ramsaya, and Ramsaya was first described back in the mid-1880s or so, and we know bugger all about it. Now, the specimen that you can see on the screen there was published in an international journal in the field, and that represents the most complete individual specimen, not only for that species, but for that entire genus itself. And we know very little about it. We don't know how it walked around. We don't know how it interacted in its environment. We know that it had a big front tooth that you can see. It had these kind of ever-growing molar teeth towards the back. It was a wombat, but it didn't function like a modern wombat. It doesn't look like a modern wombat. We're not even convinced that this thing was a burrower like a modern wombat, but we don't know because we don't have enough material to test some of these hypotheses. And again, many of the species that we talk about in terms of the extinction look like this. So if we don't even know what they look like, it's really hard to reconstruct things like their biology, or paleobiology, I should say, their palaeoecology. It's hard to understand any way that they may have interacted in the ecosystems. And if you don't have the dates for them, you don't even really know the whens of all this kind of stuff. So we have a lot of different issues going on with this stuff. One of the big arguments that you often read as well, particularly from the proponents who say, megafauna, they were not vulnerable to climate change at all. No members of the Australian megafauna or any large terrestrial animal went extinct in Australia before humans turned up. And that's despite some really intense climatic changes. And that's a really fair and reasonable argument, and it's true, but it's only true if you don't read the literature or you don't look at the fossil record, because there are so many, this is true, every species of Australian megafauna that existed up until the Pliocene, with the exception of maybe 2 species, suffered extinction. So some of the biggest kangaroos that ever existed, or the tallest kangaroos that ever existed, are known from the Pliocene, so about 3 million years ago. They did not make their way into the Quaternary at all. The second biggest marsupial that ever existed, Ureozygoma, which is the ancestor to that Diprotodon thing I was talking about, that died out in the Pliocene as well, way before we even were talking about climate change. Now, some of these organisms I'll show you at the moment, this particular study came out from the team at Flinders University a couple of years ago, and this represents the leg bone of the bird that you can see on the left there. So this is a thing called Genyornis, and Genyornis is pretty famous because it's probably in the top 5 or 10 of the biggest birds that ever existed. Now, superficially, you can see it kind of looks like an emu, but it's not part of that group at all. It's part of a very different kind of group. But this team, McInerney, Phoebe McInerney and her people, they were able to describe some bone diseases that exist in some of the fossils that are dating to around about 50 to 55,000 years ago that they've recognised on the basis of the fossil record in parts of Central Australia. And these are the sort of bone diseases that you mostly find when animals are in these really heavily drought-stressed types of environments. So again, it kind of counters that argument that big animals are not susceptible to climate change. We can see a diseased population of these things right here. This is the lower jaw of the specimen that my team and I discovered and we collected last year. And I've got a 3D model linked to it, but I can't show that to people, particularly on the Zoom at the moment, because I can't get the screen to work properly. But what we've got here is a specimen of a kangaroo. It's a very, very big kangaroo. This thing was probably about 2.5 or so meters in height. So a really big monster, but it's got another disease called lumpy jaw, which is a kind of a disease that's often caused by infection in the gum that leads to these incredible bone types of swellings. And you get these big swellings that occur underneath the ventral margin. And if you had a look at the top view of this particular specimen, you would see a big lump of bone coming out on the side of the jaw itself. And this incidence of lumpy jaw, we have independent palaeoclimate evidence to show that this particular animal died at a time of pretty intense drought. Now, our dating of the specimen is a bit uncertain. We published it as potentially Pliocene in age, but the more I think about it, for people planning along at home, I think it might actually be Pleistocene, so dating into that time frame. But again, it shows you, these diseases that these animals were susceptible to as a result of things like climate. Now, this is the other problem when it comes to testing some of these extinction ideas. Like these sites here are most of the sites that are used to produce the dates that go into those models. And straight away, you can see lots of problems with this. Like firstly, like when you think about all the different animals we're talking about, 90 different species that exist, from turtles to snakes to lizards to marsupials. We've got our birds. They have very, very different ecologies in the ancient environments. They do not share a very close evolutionary history either, because most of these things are separated in time from each other by 300 million years worth of evolution. So you can't treat these as the same organism. So they have very different biologies and very, very different ecologies themselves. The other problem is the data. We don't have enough, and there's obviously a massive bias that exists as well, where we know about megafauna for only really the southern part of the continent itself. And so the majority of fossil sites that we have are heavily, heavily biased towards those areas that you can see there. And if I had a separate map that was showing the population of where people live today, you could almost map on the distribution of megafauna sites that will match up with population density itself. So a lot of these areas that we're talking about in the northern part of the continent itself have never really even been explored in any kind of depth for fossils. And that kind of makes sense. That's fine. Okay, but we have to be aware of these biases. So it's not acceptable really to think about how diverse our modern ecosystems are, how diverse our climates are across the modern continent. We can't homogenize all this stuff and say what happened, for example, in Tasmania must have happened everywhere to everything at the same time. That makes no kind of sense at all. So some of the research I wanted to share today comes from other areas that I've been very lucky to work with. And the first place, I'm not really going to even tell you what I've done here, but I was able to go up to a place called Floraville, and I'm hoping that that will work there. So this is Floraville, right up in the southern part of the Gulf of Carpentaria up there. And I've been working with this wonderful family. I hope they're online at the moment, called the Camp family. And the Camps have been so kind and generous to me over many years. And they've allowed me to come up to their big cattle station and start scratching around looking for fossils. And this particular site here was originally found by Ernie, the Camp family back in the day, but Ernie Camp was a little boy at the time, back in the 1970s, working with a guy called Michael Archer. And Michael, I don't know if Mike's online at the moment, but Mike is one of Australia's most eminent paleontologists in the field. And Mike would go up there with his crew and they would scratch around and look for fossils. And now Ernie is the senior person on the farm itself, on the property itself. And again, being very kind to allow me to continue some of that work. So we go up there and we're looking for bones of things predominantly. And a few years ago, I was on this trip and it was a horrible trip, our field trip. We left Brisbane. We had these high cars that we picked up, and about 4 or 5 hours into the trip, the car immediately started overheating. And as it turned out, part of the belt on the engine had fallen off. And so we had no climate control on the car in any kind of way. So we're stuck on the side of a road somewhere between Chinchilla and Roma for hours on end. And what had actually happened, our car was stuck on the road, and this is funny. And we had no reception at the time, but very lucky there was a town called Jackson, just like, what's his name? Going to Jackson. What's that guy's name? Johnny Cash. There's a little town called Jackson that we could see just in a distance. So we had to leave the car behind and we walked to Jackson. And very lucky when we were there was no phone reception at all, but there was a paid phone, sorry, that was out there. So we collected all the coins that we had, and we only had 4 $2 coins amongst us. And we put the first coin in and we called the admin people within the university in our school. This is before UC, and nobody answered. And the coin went tick, and it fell down through the middle of the phone and it didn't come out again. So we're down to 3 coins. So we used our second coin and exactly the same thing happened again. After that, we did a reverse charge to school and we said, oh, this is blah, 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 blah. We need to talk to blah, blah to help us out here. And they did not accept the reverse charge. And then eventually we got through and the admin people contacted the car company and they organized the thing for us. And we were stranded there for 6 hours. But because of that 6 hours, we were delayed across the rest of the trip. So we had to rebook accommodation. It meant that by the time we got to the field locality right up in the north, we had not much time. And when we got up there as well, we couldn't find anything. Like it was just one of those completely unlucky types of field trips. Now, it was on the last day that we were walking along in an old area that we weren't even planning to go to. And I was just walking on the ground and I kind of just literally about a meter away from me, I just looked down and I saw this object that you can see right here. Now, I'm not going to tell you what this thing is at the moment at all. Some people will probably be able to recognize it. But this particular bone extends, anyway, from the back of the bone that you can see through here all the way up to about there. So that specimen might be about 20 centimeters or so kind of in length. And you can kind of make out where the bone is, right? But I was very lucky to have seen it. If I hadn't been literally there and I had been like a meter over there, I probably wouldn't have seen it at all. Now, we spent a bit of time scratching around trying to figure out how we get this thing out of the ground. And I just want to show you a quick video of that. If you could just play that video, Nani. This is a former Earth 1000 student, by the way, and also a paleo student for the paleo people. So a student from my undergrad classes. So we take these people out into the field from time to time if they're super, super keen. Yeah, if you can just go backwards. Backwards one more. Anyway, yeah, if you play that video, you might just have to click onto it. No, sorry, I'll get it cracking. You might have to just have to use this one. Yeah. So this is just an example of what it's like in the field sometimes, but that's exactly the same specimen. And I wanted to show this one at the moment, but I didn't want to tell you too much about it because the work is not published. But that one single specimen that you can see there will completely change our understanding of the long-term development of ecology in Australia, particularly when we think about predator-prey types of relationships. It's one single thing. So this organism that you can see, which you probably can't tell what it is. I know some people have seen it, like you've seen it, Michael, before. This is a thing that is completely brand new to science. It has never been described in the scientific literature before. It is a brand new species. It is a brand new genus at the same time as well. And it's really going to, by the time we get these things published, it's really going to just blow people's minds. And I don't want to say too much, but the point of me showing this to you at the moment is the fact that, again, we know so little about even basic diversity of what was going on through the ice ages themselves. And we go to a site like this that is very poorly explored, really, and we find stuff. Now, I know at least another probably 3 or 4 species of Australian megafauna that have never been published before, including another genus of something that's similar in terms of being related to that thing that you can see right there. And so again, we say we think we know what happened to the megafauna, but we don't even have a good grip on things like the diversity. Okay, so that was one side. So maybe I can come back in the future when this thing is published and tell you a bit more about it. Because to me, actually, I had a funny question from a student in my second year class today, because I was showing them a jaw of a diprotodon, which is a big, giant marsupial thing the other day. And he came up to me and said, "Is this the best thing that you've ever found? Like, what's your favorite fossil?" And I said, "Mate, I don't have a favorite fossil because, from my perspective, this is my job to do this kind of stuff. And it's not what you find, but what you find out. And so for the specimen that you saw on the screen there, it probably is my favorite fossil now, but it's because of what we found out about it, which I'm not going to tell you about, okay? Okay, now going to some other work, this involves now someone in the room, Meg Walker. And Meg's a PhD student that works with us. That's her over there waving her hand. And we've got a joint project, an ARC-funded project, to go and dive in some of the caves down at Mount Gambier in South Australia. So I know other people have worked in Mount Gambier before. Really incredible place for things like very recent volcanics. You need to go there at some point. Earlier this year, was this March, Mick? Something like that. We end up going down there on some field work, and this is just an example of how we get into some of the caves. So the caves that we're dealing with down there, they're predominantly sinkholes that have formed in limestone bedrock. Across geological periods of time, animals fall into these holes and they die in there and they make their way into the fossil record itself. So this is an untapped resource that people don't usually go into because it's hard to do that. Now, several of those people that you can see on the screen there, they're cave diving specialists. So they're part of this organisation called the Cave Diving Association of Australia, CDAA. Now, the CDAA are part of our industrial organisation that supports the ARC funding that we got in this particular project. And this is the important thing, again, for students. Like, you can't do science just by yourself. You can't work in a silo. You have to work it broadly across. And Meg, we're so lucky to be able to work with the CDAA, because if we weren't working with these specialist cave divers, we wouldn't be able to recover half of the bones that we're interested in. So it's basically an untapped resource, and this beautiful partnership between academics, the CDAA, and they give up all of their time to come and help us with this sort of stuff. Now, this is a cave here that was described to me by that bloke in the fluoro there, a guy called Joe, as being a cave that basically opens up, and it's like you're diving right down into the middle of the MCG, like a big sporting stadium. It's that big underneath that tiny little hole there. And in case anybody talks to Suze, our OH&S person, I did not go into that cave during that field trip itself, okay? Just in case anybody asked. But Meg did go in, right? And I didn't go in, did I, Meg? But this is what it's like. So if you could play that video, honey. This is what it's like going down. Yeah, if you just, yep. It's a bit chunky. I don't know why it's so chunky. But that's what it's like going down. So it's pretty extreme kind of stuff. And Meg's all screaming and carrying on. Meg is actually one of the scientists, though, that is trained to do a lot of this cave work. So a lot of people might have scuba tickets. It doesn't mean that you can go and scuba dive around in a cave itself. That would be terribly dangerous. But Meg is one of those people. And I may or may not have gone into that cave just to snorkel around the top of it. But it's just like, it's such an incredible experience. This is what that cave looks like in terms of a map. So that hole that you can see where Meg just went into is literally just that little dot at the top. So you can snorkel around the top of that white bit. And that's the rest of the cave around it. So it's literally like, you know, what is it, 150, 200 meters across? It's just absolute monster. 200 meters. So it's a really big kind of system. But that's what we're doing. We're going into these sinkholes, these caves, and looking for stuff. Now, the majority of the things that we find, and that's one of our partners from Flinders University, and this is a photo taken by a guy called Stevie T. And Stevie T is one of the members of the CDAA. He's a brilliant photographer and videographer going down underwater. And you can see a big bone in the left-hand corner there. Most of the stuff that we find belong to domesticates, so things like cattle, sheep and horses that either die or get thrown, the carcass gets thrown into the cave. But that's an example of what it's like underwater. A lot of times it's really, really difficult because the sediment just silts up really, really quickly, so you can't actually see what you're doing. Now, I did want to show this cave, though. This is a thing called Tent Cave. So there's a beautiful trap put over the top of the opening. Our scuba divers go into it. Meg doesn't go into that yet, or probably ever. You have to be trained. People have died in this particular cave. And anyway, these guys go down. They swim about 900 meters underground in the water in complete darkness over a distance of like 900 meters. It takes about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour or so. They do their work for about 5 or 10 minutes and they come back up to the surface. And on this particular trip, I was absolutely blown away by what they brought up. And so the divers came back and they were holding these giant bones, and you can see, you know, these two bones in this particular case. You know, the first bone at the top there is probably, I can't remember, 50 centimeters across or so, just as a scale. And they had it wrapped up in a mesh bag at the time. And I just presumed that it was going to be another bloody horse or another bloody cow because it was brown and it was long and it was well preserved. And then when they took it out of the bag, my mind just blew. I was so insanely excited about it. And as it turns out, these are actually the lower leg bones of this animal called a palaeoecological, or otherwise known as the marsupial tapir. Now, this is one of the weirdest animals within the entire megafauna kind of community. We know so little about it. It was a big animal. It was a cousin of Diprotodon. We know bugger all. But these bones here that you can see, the top bone is a femur and the bottom bone is, so the thigh bone, the bottom bone is the humerus or the upper arm bone. These represent the third, I think, and the sixth bones of this particular species that have ever been found across all of Australia. So more than 150 years of collecting, third and sixth. So again, it gives you an idea about how little we know about these things. Now, the final site I want to talk about is something that happened in partnership with this wonderful natural resource company called Acidic Pacific, working in partnership with the West Australian Museum and the foundation of the WA Museum as well. And we've got several of my colleagues, I think, online at the moment, wherever the camera is, I think maybe up there somewhere. But we ended up going across this area called Cape Preston, which is in Western Australia. And this project was, this particular fossil site here is the big fossil site that I wanted to talk about today, especially. And in this particular location, it was around about the early 1990s that some bones were reported. A group from the West Australian Museum went up to this particular locality and started having a scratch around, and they found all these diprotodons, like skeletons of these things. And nobody had really gone up there since. It was, some dates of this were published in a very famous paper in 2001, but nobody's ever really touched it. Now, Kenny Travion, who is a former postdoc here at the university, got in touch with me. And Kenny is now the curator of mammals and birds over at the West Australian Museum. And he called me out one day and said, Gilbert, I want to go back up there. We've got support from Acidic Pacific, and the museum and the foundation are all behind this sort of stuff. We want to go up there and find fossils. And he showed me some photos from the early 1990s. And I said to Kenny, you're dreaming, mate. You are not going to find anything. So the fossils back in the early 1990s were exposed on the surface. If you know anything about how erosion works, these things aren't going to be there. But Kenny ended up going up there with a small group, and this is a photo of a diprotodon jaw that Kenny found. So it's ugly, but I was actually shocked that Kenny found anything there. But what we got here is a part of a bone at the bottom. Those funny looking, very weathered, ugly looking things, the teeth at the top there. And, you know, Kenny was convinced that was a really good site. And I said, Kenny, no, it's not. It looks horrible. I don't think it's worth going up there. But anyway, we were able to get some more support from the mining company, and we did go up there. And when I walked across there for the first time, it looks pretty bloody sparse. And I was actually right about the bones not being there. But there were more bones that had been exposed since the 1990s. And when you start to walk across an area like this, your mind just blows, because it's like you're actually looking at the Serengeti. It's that incredibly interesting and diverse. Now, what had happened back in the day, the original fossils were found sort of in the foreground of that photo. They've all eroded away, but at the same time, that big orange dirt bank that you can see at the back there had been eroding at a rate of around about a foot on average per year. So it had exposed since the 90s another, what's that, 10, 20 meters worth of stuff. So there's new material coming up at the time. And as you start to walk across, it doesn't look like much, but when you look down on the ground, you can see stuff. So that's my big hoof that you can see with the bone kind of coming down through here and extending down through there. And these are diprotodons. There's tons and tons of diprotodon bones in this locality itself. That's part of a vertebral column from a near complete diprotodon skeleton. So again, for young people or people who know nothing about paleontology, if you've ever seen Jurassic Park and you remember the very first scene where they're sitting around with a dinosaur brushing away, that does not exist. That's absolutely artistic license in the movies. This is almost artistic license as well. You often rarely see articulated complete remains of these extinct animals. So it's something that's magnificent, like incredible to be able to even find anything like this. Noni, can you play that video as well? This is just a video showing how difficult it is in some ways to do the excavations. So the specimen that you can see in front of you in a second, and I should say as well, like, again, I don't work by myself. These are people that are volunteers for the West Australian Museum. We work with local traditional owners. We do not dig anything actually without having a traditional owner on site first. They're volunteers from the mining company as well. The mining company has been brilliant. But the specimen that you can see is the complete skull of a diprotodon. There's curved banana-shaped things down the front there, front teeth from the diprotodon itself, and where that person is brushed in Kayla is the back part of the skull right there. It's really difficult work, but it's incredibly rewarding when you get this stuff up out of the ground itself. It's hard. Like, this is just a photo of one of our videographers that we had out there of the number of flies that you're often dealing with. This is a selfie from me, and one of the things you can't see very clearly here is the number of flies in my eyeballs behind the glasses right there. So it's pretty uncomfortable. That's the best photo I ever took of anything. which I didn't know I had taken at the time. You can see a diprotodon in the background, of course. And this is just an idea of some of the temperatures that we deal with. So it was literally on this day at about 43 degrees or so. Ignore that feels like temperature, because I can assure you that's not accurate. It felt like 43 degrees. But on that actual day, we had a press conference on site that brought up ABC, Channel 7, all these different media organizations, as well as the local ministers for the state and all that sort of stuff, to just announce some of the discoveries that had been found. So it was a crazy old day working up into that, but I kind of like working in 43 degree or 44 degree temperature, but nobody else seems to. This here is a photo. I was telling Noni about this the other day. This is one of the most wonderful experiences I've ever had in any aspect of education. Like, it was lovely to teach you guys this semester, but this was better. On that day there, that person in the middle with the green shirt was dying. He did not want to go and do this outreach event, but he did. And with Kenny and somebody else, we ended up driving about an hour north at about midday to visit a small school as part of a community program for young Indigenous boys. And these boys that you see here, they're all around about 10 years old, and it's part of a program that was set up by the school and supported by the mining company, where they wanted to engage young people to get them into the classroom and get them educated and, you know, get them away from several of the social issues that happen and you might be familiar with in some of these small outback towns. Now, all of the boys here were so enthusiastic about the stuff that we're talking about. We had fossils and all sorts of things to introduce to them. And yeah, it's just such a wonderful moment. Like, we went to the school, a couple of little boys came and shook our hands, and they took us to the classroom. We went into the classroom itself, and the teacher there, Townie, he introduced all of the people that were here. So he said, "Oh, this is Kenny from the museum. Kenny does this and that." There's a PhD student called Lucy. He goes, "Oh, Lucy does this or that." Then he goes, "Oh, and this is Gilbert, and Gilbert's from Queensland. He does this." And immediately, all these like 20 little hands just shot up in the air. And you know how if you ever go to a research conference and there's some old white male with a big beard and he always puts his hand up and says, "I don't have a question, I have more of a comment." It was like that, but for all of these little boys here, because they all had a story of something to do with Queensland. Like, their cousin went to Queensland, or crocodiles live in Queensland, all this amazing stuff they know about Queensland. So it's such a really interesting, funny thing, but they loved everything that we were talking about there. So I had made an app using augmented reality and was showing them fossils there, and they bloody loved it. And they were so engaged with all that sort of stuff. And I'm just so impressed with the school teacher and the school itself, as well as the support from local industry and council and stuff like that in supporting such a program. And it's just nice to be part of it. Like, I feel it was, you know, I was there to educate and teach, but I felt like I learned more probably than the students in that case. Now, in terms of the science, this is a map of part of the creek that we're dealing with here that was produced by Jade Williams. And Jade was a recent honours student who worked on the site, and it may or may not be online at the moment. But we mapped in all these things. So every of these dark kind of splodges represents predominantly diprotodon fossils in that case. So the fossils are spread out over a creek of several hundred meters, as you can see with the scale bar up there. And we found megafauna fossils in several parts of this particular creek itself. This is a guess who kind of game for everyone, but this is one of the fossils that's not a diprotodon. So almost everything you see is a diprotodon. This here is a lower jaw bone fragment from one of the giant wombats. So this is like a 300 kilogram wombat that was found by one of the WA people, Kayla. I forgot to take a photo of this thing, but this is an emu, and we do find emu eggshells in the site. And this is another funny thing that we found this year, and we've walked across this area hundreds and maybe thousands of times and never seen anything until this year, where we found a bone from a crocodile. So this is a crocodile scoop. So we've got at least, you know, 4 or 5 vertebrate animals, so backbone animals, preserved here, as crocodile. But we also find evidence for things like mangroves. So the terms here, lateral means sideways, vertical means up and down, and a rhizolith is just a fossil plant. And a pneumatophore are those mangrove plants that you see where you have the roots that just grow straight upwards like that. And so we can find fossils of all of these things. And this is one of the pneumatophores up in the top left. These are some of the lateral roots, and you can probably make out the black and white scale bar up there. So it's a pretty big root fossils occurring in all these areas. And these represent mangroves. So straight away, we've got a palaeoclimate signature now that's absolutely distinct and associated with the bones. We've got megafauna amongst mangroves here. And there is no other site like that has ever been documented anywhere on the continent where we have these vertebrate land animals mixed into this intertidal zone. And I haven't seen any example of that anywhere across the planet, at least in the Quaternary itself. So this is something that's super special and unique. Now, we have other evidence of it being mangroves, including these different types of mangrove mud whelks that are only found in mangrove environments, so Telescopia and Terebrolia. These are also really important food sources for early Indigenous people in Australia. Lots of different snails, and again, these are mangrove specialists for the most part that you can see. We have oysters as well. So we have some examples of oysters, and you might say, well, oysters, where do they grow? They grow at sea level itself. And what's the association between the mangroves and the oysters and the bones? Well, that's actually a diprotodon bone that that person is holding there. So we've got oysters growing on the top of the bones themselves, which is pretty remarkable. Lots of other different types of bivalves as well. Crustaceans, we get little crabs and shrimps being preserved that you can see through here. Now, one of the things that was, again, this is one of the most memorable things that I've had happen to me in recent times, but a lot of times when you're in the field, you're trying to reconstruct what an ecosystem might be like, and a lot of times you kind of have to use your imagination for what things might have been like. But one of the opportunities that we had is working with one of the mining team, a guy called Aaron Turner. Aaron took us for a drive out towards some of the modern mangroves off the coast of WA, and it was, for me, it was like looking up, Jurassic Park reconstructions of all the extinct animals, or reading a book about the reconstructions of the environments, because everything that we're looking at in terms of fossils, we could see living there as actual ecosystems. So we had the big roots from modern mangroves. We had those aerial roots from those species, and you might be able to make out those pneumatophores, so tiny little vertical roots that were growing up there. We found exactly the same species of the mud whelks. We found those crabs, and we found bones amongst the mangrove out there as well. Obviously no diprotodon bones, because these things are extinct. But that was an absolutely wonderful experience for us. How did they get there? So if you don't want to see how we think they may have got there, look away now. But if you've ever seen like a David Attenborough documentary where you have these animals crossing these big crocodile-infested rivers, a lot of times these things get caught up in floods and they drown and they float, and sometimes they die and they could get caught up in habitat growing along the creek. It's potentially something like that. Some of the work from the honours student Jade seems to think that maybe it was only one or two animals that may have died at any one time, so the entire assemblage may have accumulated over a period of many, many years itself. That's something that we're still working on at the moment, but that's something that we're talking about. The other thing that we've done too is map all of the fossils using some of the infrastructure provided to us from the mining company. So they have these fancy GPS mapping things that can get down to precision of like literally millimeters. So millimeters spatially and millimeters vertically. And so we went through and mapped all of the stuff. And what you can see here is that this is the elevation of the different fossils and other artifacts, that, not artifacts, but different fossils really, that we found relative to the modern sea level. And so this is the elevation. This is modern sea level here, about 7 or 8 meters or so. We're finding evidence for the mangrove ecosystem up there. At around about, let's say about 5 meters above modern sea level, again, we've got more mangroves. We've got mangroves and megafauna at about 4.5 meters. And across the bulk of the exposure, we've got mangroves and megafauna exposed quite a lot. Now, this is the thing that really is blowing my mind now, because what we're looking at here is evidence of sea level change as we go through the Quaternary itself. So sea levels are dropping. Now, mangroves themselves, they don't grow on the top of a mountain, do they? They don't grow at the bottom of the ocean. They grow at the intertidal zone. So if we're finding mangroves and megafauna, that's a proxy for things like sea level change. So here we can see at least 4 stages of sea level change, up there, there, and there. So one of the questions we have is when? How old is this kind of stuff? And you can figure that out using your understanding of sea level curves across other parts of the Indian Ocean itself. So what you're looking at here is the sea level estimated curves for the last 450,000 years or so. So this is based on other work, not our work, as part of the Indian Ocean. The dark line in the middle is the mean age of the sea levels as we change through time, and the sort of grey lines on either side, they're basically the 95% confidence interval, so the uncertainty there. Now, for us to use the existing data, we also have to consider uplift rates. So this part of Australia is being uplifted at a rate of around about 0.05 millimeters per year, which doesn't sound a lot, but like over a course of 100,000 years, that's like 5 meters, right? So we have to consider all that kind of stuff. The other thing about the Quaternary is that we saw incredible changes in sea levels and temperatures and other things. But for sea levels alone, you can see that at parts in the Quaternary, like 20,000 years ago, sea levels were 120 meters lower than what they are today. And then they've come back up by 120 meters in vertical height. So that's pretty incredible. But if we're dealing with mangrove ecosystems, we're getting mangroves. We can only have those mangroves when we have those high sea levels themselves. So when we model our uplift rates and take into consideration the existing sea level curve, there's only certain times across the Quaternary that our deposits could date to. Now, it's not going to be where we live today because, 10,000 years, we got diprotodons and a bunch of other things. It could only be around about 100,000, 120,000, only there, and probably not there. We think it's probably about there. So our preliminary dating at the moment is placing the deposits round about that last, what we call the interglacial itself. So round about there. And we've definitely got those 4 episodes of sea level change as we go through time. And so we've tied together the mangrove story with the megafauna. So we're taking these animals, putting them into a real ecosystem now, tying that to palaeoclimate. And that is something that we haven't been able to do with most other fossil sites across Australia itself. So this is why I'm so excited about this particular locality. So it's great that we've got diprotodons, that's all cool, but we're tying it to something that is really wonderful and important for us for testing some of these extinction ideas. I don't have time to thank everyone. I could have many, many slides of people that I need to thank, but I just really want to point out, like CITIC Pacific and the traditional owners from that area especially have been so good, but also the ABC Catalyst people for bringing these animals to the people within the public. I did want to share one final thing too. In coinciding with the ABC Catalyst documentary, the team from ABC Education also produced these wonderful, wonderful resources for education of school children, anywhere from grade 4 or 5 up to about grade 10 or 11 or so. And if you want to get a copy of them, I don't know if you can scan that at the moment, but you can just search for ABC Education Megafauna if that's something that you're super interested into. And that's something that I had a role in helping out develop as well. Anyway, thank you so much for your time, everyone, and everybody on the Zooms at the moment as well for joining us today. Yes. Do you usually have questions after? Okay. Does anybody have a question for me at the moment? Yes. You tell me. Maybe, well, we know that we have, okay. Do you know how many bones that we have that show evidence of butchery for the megafauna at the moment? Less than that. Less than that. 0, yeah. So we have 0. So we know nothing about the ecological interactions between megafauna and humans. And I'm not saying that because we have none, that means that they weren't hunted out. At the same time, we know that there was really intense climatic changes operating through time. We've lost most of those other pre-Quaternary megafauna before, millions of years ago themselves. So big animals are obviously susceptible to climatic shifts, particularly big ones. We know that in the last glacial cycle, so that period that we're talking about with the mangroves going closer towards modern times, that episode there was the most intense glacial shift across the entire, well, for several of the interglacials and maybe the entire 2.5 million years. That was the hardest time to live. And so it would have been bloody hard for the first humans to turn up. So I don't know how they managed to survive. And that's another really incredible story in and of itself. I don't know. We don't have enough data to test it. Like, I think there's a strong signature for climate, but that doesn't mean that humans weren't doing things at the same time. But the hypotheses are testable in part on the basis of dating. So some of the overkill human did it kind of hypotheses depend on temporal overlap between the first humans and megafauna. And if you have a look at that on a global perspective, on the continental perspective, sorry, some of that overlap is tens of thousands of years, like tens of thousands of years itself. So, there wasn't a rapid extinction for many of those organisms. Almost certainly there would have been some level of interaction, but we've known so little about it. But it's important, and thank you so much for asking about it, because this is something I haven't really touched on. But, a lot of the stuff, people might think, oh, it's just an academic kind of question. It's just like a question we're doing for, for shits and giggles. But it's not. We're talking about here extinction events that occur in exactly the same geological time frame that we're in at the moment. And we're talking about a time frame when all of the modern plants and the fauna and the ecosystems and the climate, that's all came to be during the Quaternary itself. The organisms that we have today that we study and we're interested in conserving, whether it's a koala or some species of a rat or, some lizard or something, they lived alongside the megafauna as well. So it's really important to understand why they didn't go extinct and how they managed to survive and what happened to them across the course of that time itself. So I think there's really incredible and critical things that we need to know about the megafauna, that is not just a question of extinction of these animals, but things that can feed into modern conservation strategies going forward in the future too. Maybe that's a presentation for another day. Yes, Aidan. Yeah, so Aidan's just asked, what role did the diprotodons have in the mangrove ecosystem? And the answer to that is we don't know enough about it just yet. So when you look at a lot of the bones are horizontally laid out. So it seems to be a case that they may have been washed in and died amongst the mangroves. One of the things that we can see though, there's a couple of specimens where the bones are almost vertical though. And you might think, oh, well, if animals are getting washed in, how do you get long bones that are sort of that long, just sinking down? So it could be a case that maybe they're walking in and then falling down into holes or sinking into the mud and getting trapped. That's not very common. There's only 1 or 2 specimens that are really like that, but hard to kind of know. But you know, when we can get a lot of the fossils preserved as well, and that's another ongoing problem. It's really, really hard to work this material. But when we can get more of these things preserved, get the bones cleaned up so we can see surfaces and do other geochemical analyses, we might be able to have a better clue there. Yes?
Can you show us how much we don't know
yeah. Start what's it? Yeah. Yeah, well, that's a good question too. So the question was basically, what can we do to increase people working in the field? And it really comes down to funding. I think it comes down to awareness, but a lot of the issues that we have, I would say, aren't restricted to this research question or this research field, but it's all research, no matter what you're doing, from history to, you know, rocket science to medical science across Australia. There's been a real problem, I would say, in terms of research funding across this space in Australia. That seems to have gone down and down and down over the course of many years now, and it's unfortunate. I don't know what to say about that, but you know, I don't know. I don't know what to say. So, question up here. Who's that from? Gillian. Are you incorporating Indigenous culture, intellectual property, and data sovereignty? Yes. Yeah, we work, like I was saying before, like particularly with the group from, when we're doing the WA stuff, like we don't dig anything without having, you know, traditional owners on site working alongside us. And that's been a really wonderful thing for me personally, like getting to learn about people on the land, about traditional owner, you know, practices and cultures and stuff like that. And we've been very lucky for the traditional owners to take us to some of the places where they protect some of their own things of significance to them within the broader area itself. And that's been such a wonderful thing. Working with the traditional owners as well, it's been such a lovely opportunity to see how much they value working with people like us as well. And I value their contributions to interpretation of everything as well. And they love the idea that together as a group, we can help tell the story of these organisms. In terms of material, they're very excited for the fossils to be curated and collected, both on site where possible, in the local community. So we've actually donated several specimens to local communities where they don't end up back in, you know, the State Museum back down in Perth or anything like that. So that's been a wonderful thing. A lot of the material that we have at the moment does go back to Perth, and it's awaiting preparation and all that kind of stuff. And it's one of those things where it takes time. It takes, again, funding and support from things like the museum as well to be able to have the infrastructure and time to be able to produce this stuff. A lot of the stuff that we do as well, the hardest bit of anything is not what you do in the field, but what you do later back in the lab environment itself, like finding out the significance of that kind of stuff. So there's lots of overlap and interaction in that space. Yeah, Bryden.
With your work at the First Nation, have you heard of any potential dream marks or reference?
Yeah, it's a great question. No, up there they don't talk about stories at all. Or maybe they have stories, but they haven't shared it with us. But I was very lucky to work with a group from where Michael works with near Kempsey, a bunch of traditional owners, and there's several different groups over there. And I had this experience a couple of years ago. They had this workshop up here at the university, and Michael was very good, and he brought up several of the traditional owners to this workshop, and we spoke about a lot of stories and stuff like that. And I kind of sat back, and Michael, you probably remember this. Like, I remember hearing this story about from the traditional owners about this mountain over here that looked like a giant bandicoot, or this thing over here that looked like a giant wombat. And I started to think in a completely different way that, you know, these might not just be stories anymore. These might be observations. And an observation, maybe they did see a giant wombat or a giant snake or a giant whatever at some point in the past, and they're relating that story to the landscapes that they see. But it's observation, and that's what science is. Science is all about observation itself. So maybe that is a testable hypothesis that you could borrow the knowledge that the traditional owners are sharing with you and ask the question, did giant wombats live in this area, or did giant snakes live in that particular area? And it completely changed around my mindset of thinking about those kind of things. So, you know, yeah, it's a very interesting one. And we do have some megafauna in that particular locality. Hey.
Last 1,000 years ago, they used dating of the volcanoes to date the tails, and that would date the
Yeah, amazing, isn't it?
So what is required temperature for the tails?
Yep.
Not saying about the eruption.
Yep.
But
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's an integration of knowledge. Like, we don't have all of the answers for this sort of stuff, but we can work with people who can help us with that interpretation. I think it's really wonderful. I really love it so much. It's really nice. Anyway, so is that it? Do we have time to go to lunch or whatever? Okay, cool. I guess on behalf of myself, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for joining us. So thank you online and in the room today.
Thanks, Gilbert.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Sorry, but I'm just playing the videos.
Thank you.